Everybody at the Brussels Liberty Network meeting. So as always, we'll have two parts. The first part is a keynote speech. There will actually be two keynote interventions this time around. And then the second, we'll do a tour around the table. The first part will be filmed also for the State of Europe series of Riks Europe, a YouTube channel I work with. And then the second part we'll do off the record, so the left will not be able to figure out the plan. So, of course, the topic of today is the American election, which was won by Donald Trump in an enormous landslide. Personally, I'm happy with that. I don't think Trump is an orthodox free marketeer on every issue, to put it mildly. Yeah, he wants to impose tariffs and maybe risk a trade war with Europe. And also it's very interesting to see what the response of the European Commission will be. Maybe they will start first, which I think would be very stupid. You can always make a deal with Trump, so let's try to make a deal. But if you think about it, you know, the three people sort of closest to him are his vice president, J.D. Vance, who's close to Peter Thiel, of course Elon Musk, who's now even part of the Trump family. He's on the family picture. And then Vivek Ramaswamy, who's also quite solid. So I think all three of those are, I would say, quite libertarian. I mean, two political standards, also not perfect. Just to stress that if you you know, look at things from a free market conservative perspective, and this meeting is meant to bring people together holding these philosophical values, of course in a broad way, then you know there's actually quite a lot of cause for hope. A very specific topic is how to deal with Russia, but we'll discuss that in a moment. So I'm more than delighted to have two guest speakers. To my left is Lars Patrick Berg, who has served as a member of European Parliament, as a member of the ECR group. He's from Germany. And Matt Robinson. Matt is the director of the ECIC, the Euro Gulf Information Center, which is a great think tank focused on relations between the Gulf and Europe. And Matt has also served as the chairman of the Northern Ireland Conservatives. So I think two very solid speakers. So I would like to give you the opportunity to maybe first give your thoughts, then we can have a bit of a Q&A before we move to the tour de table. So please, Lars.
Thank you, Peter. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends. Thank you for the invitation. It's always nice to be back to Brussels, and as a former member of a parliament, as a former politician, it's always nice to be frank and blunt, to have publicity. Thank you very much for that. But I would just like to wrap up in a nutshell, because I think the dialogue, the discussion will be probably for you more interesting. How I do see the current development with the elections that have been held in the US and the implications for Europe and for Germany. So I think the establishment, vast majority of the political establishment in Europe and in Germany, they were not very smart in brandishing or branding Donald Trump as an evil force. Pre-election wise, I think this is very bad, and in regards to the media, the same principle applies. The mainstream media in Germany mostly were very, very anti-Trump. A couple of days ago there was a poll issued, and it highlighted that Kamala Harris most likely will achieve 78 to 80% of overall votes. So this is either stupid, it certainly isn't very smart, and it's an implication that something is going wrong for a long time in regards to mainstream media. Nevertheless, what kind of implications does the election of the 47th President Donald Trump now have on Europe and on Germany? I think predominantly on Germany, the economic issues will be overwhelming. I think that most likely the issue of tariffs will be a big challenge for German industry corporations, mostly the automotive and the supplier industry, and that will be probably hampering economic growth in Germany overall, because currently the country is in an economic and political crisis. Overall, we have witnessed yesterday that the traffic light coalition, the ruling coalition in Germany, has fallen apart. That has been ballooning this crisis for months and months and months, but I think it's a relief for many people, not only for politically minded people. And then we have a lot of bustling and a lot of activity here in Brussels. Currently the designate commissioners are being questioned, and we have the hearings here in Brussels. And today we have an interesting meeting in Budapest. Viktor Orban invited the heads of state to gather to convene in Budapest, and all this together I think will be something that is a wake-up call for Europe and for many European governments. I think that maybe the idea of European sovereignty that Macron was talking about 2 years ago could could be something that the Europeans will pursue more intensely and with more conviction. European sovereignty, I'm convinced that the Trump administration will put more pressure on European governments, especially on the German government, to live up to their to funding security and defense. Although there's been some positive development now in Germany to this, but there will be more pressure. And Trump made a few statements in regards to the German government and Germany, saying they have to do their homework. They still haven't done their homework in terms of security and defense funding, and they are stealing our lunch. The Germans and the German industry and German corporations. So altogether, these statements are an implication that it will be, for the new German government most likely next year, a big challenge to tackle. But I think it would be wise not to condemn Trump and the administration, but to find a smart way to deal with these issues and to focus on Europe and say, make Europe great again, make Germany great again, make Italy great again, and this applies to all the other countries. Last point, I would hope, and I really wish that all these developments will be linked to a rule-based order and not to single deals. You mentioned this issue that Trump is a deal maker, yes, and deals can be great, but I think it's very important in times like this to stick to rules and to the rule-based order. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lars. In that respect, I want to remark that even if there would be a deal, for preferential tariff access between Europe and the States, which would be great, we should not forget that under the World Trade Organization rules, then Europe and the States are forced to also give the same, tariff access to other trading partners like South Korea. So it's indeed not all that simple, but of course frameworks can be adapted as per whatever the democratic majorities want. Because I think the priority should be, of course, to have an all-out trade war between Europe and America. That's the last thing that Europe can have at this very moment. So, Matt.
Thank you, Peter, and thanks all the sponsors for the invitation today. What to say? This was a comeback of all comebacks. The first US president since Grover Cleveland to lose re-election, come back and win the whole thing over again. Trump has managed to build a movement, revolutionize the Republican Party. I mean, this is not the Republican Party anyway. This is the Trump MAGA party. And I think he was able to read the electorate in a way the Democratic Party and the Harris campaign just couldn't. And to quote, ironically, a Democratic Party strategist, James Carville, it's the economy, stupid. And the Harris campaign turned this thing into a referendum on the previous Trump presidency and on the issue of democracy. Somewhat irony considering not one vote was cast in the vice president's favor in the primary process, but she didn't even run in the primary process. The Democratic Party, I think, there'll be a lot of self-reflection, and the Democratic Party will go into a long, cold winter to reflect on just exactly what went wrong, both on the congressional side and the presidential side in 2024. But I think it all started to go wrong when President Biden, an honorable man with a distinguished long career, decided, foolishly I think, to run for re-election. And what he did was deprive the Democratic Party of an open and vigorous primary campaign. A primary campaign, by the way, that it's my view that I think Vice President Harris would have lost. Time and time again, when in the previous primaries in 2020, she ran a pretty ineffective primary campaign. And I think it ultimately, no disrespect to the vice president, but I think it deprived the Democratic Party of a better candidate. So, and that combined with the MAGA movement that Trump built, I think gave the Republicans an incredible roadmap. I mean, there are a lot of pundits that thought a Trump win was very much on the cards. I certainly would have subscribed to that, but the level of this victory is just quite stunning. I mean, this is an electoral college landslide, but not only that, Trump got within 5 points in states like New Jersey. Absolutely incredible. And it looks, while there's a lot of votes to come in still from California, it looks like he's won the popular vote, or that margin will be squeezed as many Californian ballots come in favor of the vice president. But nonetheless, this was stunning. Now, what are the
maybe one thing, Matt, if I may just interfere, I read this super interesting statistic showing that if only Kamala had won California, it would take 130,000 more votes. And I think 2 more swing states where she needed like an extra 30,000 votes or something. So she needed 240,000 votes across the blue wall. So that means 30K in Wisconsin, 80K in another swing state, and 130K in Pennsylvania. So, and remember that she did not choose the governor of Pennsylvania, Josh Shapiro, who's a popular Democratic governor, and she did not choose him because he was Jewish. She, of course, never communicated that, but that was clear. So I think this just like, sorry to speak, to interfere, but I really want to say that this is like, just stresses how well-deserved her defeat is.
Yeah, and certainly there will be a lot of raking over the coals as it relates to her vice presidential pick. Tim Walz reminded me a lot of Tim Kaine, Hillary Clinton's pick, and actually I think there's a lot of comparisons with the ill-fated Clinton-Kaine campaign of 2016 and the Harris-Walz campaign of 2024. So domestically, and some of the implications for this, well, I think you probably. It looks, well, not 100% sure, it looks like the Republicans are well placed to hopefully hold on to that House majority. Obviously, they've won back control of the Senate. You factor in that with a conservative leading Supreme Court, Trump will most definitely I think there's a real prospect that somebody like a Clarence Thomas will probably use this opportunity to retire. Trump will probably get another Supreme Court pick. You have the imperial presidency here. You have a congressional majority. You have the judicial branch that is very sympathetic to elements of the administration. And you have a president-elect that doesn't dare to be challenged by his own party. I mean, this will be one of the most powerful U.S. administrations in modern memory. What does that mean beyond that, further afield? Well, from a European standpoint, we've got Baku coming out the COP conference. It wouldn't surprise me if the Trump administration pulled the U.S. again out of the Paris climate. That wouldn't surprise me at all. As it relates to some of the Ukraine and the ongoing conflict in the Middle East, I think there is guarded cause for optimism. You've got to look at what President Trump did with the Abraham Accords in his first term in office. Personnel in his administration, people like Jared Kushner, had incredibly good relations with Arab Gulf partners there, has continued to outside of office. So I think any hypothetical peace process in the Middle East, especially as it relates to Israel and Palestine, will need especially the Arab Gulf states tenfold. And I think the previous Trump administration demonstrated that it could work very constructively with the GCC. In fact, Trump's first ever visit when he was the then 45th president of the United States was to Saudi Arabia. So I'll be very curious to see what the first international trip.
With the famous picture.
Yeah, exactly. So maybe it's to Saudi again. We'll see. I think there's going to be a reckoning as well, some of the irresponsible rhetoric of European leaders. When Trump lost re-election in 2020, and he did, and he did lose. I think it was a mistake I think it was a huge mistake for Trump not to attend the inauguration of President Biden, but that's a separate issue. When he lost that election, Europe wrote him off, so he's done, and they said some horrific things. And looking at my own country, the United Kingdom, the current sitting Foreign Secretary David Lammy compared him to a Nazi. In fact, it was that this issue was raised in Prime Minister's questions by the new Conservative Party leader, Kemi Badenoch, just yesterday. I don't know how a sitting a British Foreign Secretary is going to navigate healthy diplomatic relations with the United States and Trump administration when they've said some of those things. And the same can be said for a lot of leaders in Europe. So I think it's time for them to grow up a little bit. The US is an important ally, regardless of who's in the White House for Europe. We need the United States and we need positive relationships. And NATO needs the US. And I think some of Trump's pressure in the past on Europe, and Lars correctly touched on this, paying up as it relates to security and defense, is welcome. Doesn't mean you're necessarily a NATO hawk. It means, I think, arguably quite the contrary. You want a NATO that's well-funded and sustainable for the next 100 years. And I hope the Trump administration navigate that. I don't want to go over my allotted time, but I'll conclude with this. The one reflection point that a lot of pundits haven't touched on yet is while the victory was impressive and he's brought Congress with him, from day one he's a lame duck, which is quite an unusual turn of events for somebody that's been freshly elected again. So it won't be long until the US will start turning their attention to 2028, ironically, and who is going to be the successor of this movement. Obviously, J.D. Vance has had an incredible rise, was only just elected to the US Senate 2 years ago, is now probably one of the youngest vice presidents in US history, and arguably is the Republican presumptive nominee in 4 years now. Of course, he'll be well challenged for that in the primaries, and sitting vice presidents, as this current one has proven, don't have great track records to successfully rise to the presidency. But I think this Trump election already poses incredible questions as it relates to 4 years from now and the next election. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Before I go to the Q&A, maybe I'd like to know your thoughts specifically on the Trump plan for Ukraine.
That's a good and very difficult question, but he was making various statements last couple of months, last couple of years on Ukraine, claiming that he could end this war within days.
1 day.
Or 1 day even, which is quite miraculous. But I think you have to differentiate between his gross language, which I don't like very much, and the campaign now, and realpolitik. And it could be the case that he will find a solution that would be something that Putin could find favorable as well. But the question is, what about the Ukrainian people that have been suffering for nearly 3 years now with this catastrophic impact of this war? What about all the innocent civilians that have been killed? I made a statement when I was in Parliament. I said that these people also die for us, and I still believe in this. So to be precise to your question, it might be the case that this war is really ended in a couple of months or in a year maybe, but I fear that it will not be very beneficial for the Ukrainian people. Question is, to what extent are European governments and the German government willing to pursue the principle of Interessenpolitik, making Europe, making Germany and other countries great again, and putting national interest first, is a question I can't answer currently.
Thank you.
I think there's a big question as to what the Trump plan will be, and Trump has proven, he's a very transactional operator, and his approach to things can change day to day. But I think we just need to look at the in tray of congratulatory remarks from world leaders. Obviously, President Zelensky gave, I thought, a very gracious and quite a warm congratulatory note to President-elect Trump, and I think, to paraphrase to a degree, welcomed any and was curious as to what a Trump peace plan would look for the region. I think you've only got any move to bring that conflict to an end has got to be welcomed, but the devil's in the detail. And obviously, from an international legal standpoint, you do worry about the precedent of in any deal of surrendering territory, Ukrainian territory to Russia that was illegally annexed. You worry about the precedent and international laws that relates to that. But saying that, the conflict needs to come to an end. The purse strings and the funding for it is on borrowed time, to be blunt about it. The US congressional Republicans, regardless of who had won this election, even if Harris had won this election, congressional Republicans are already going to start to put the brakes on appropriations for Ukraine spending. So I think it's arguably I think it's in the Ukraine's interest. While funding is good right now, to take that strategic advantage and try and have some sort of negotiated outcome. But I mean, there's so many unknowns, and we'll see. I'd be curious as to who his Secretary of State is. He burned a lot of bridges and members of his previous administration, but one of which that he didn't was Mike Pompeo, who was his first as CIA director, then his Secretary of State. I would love to see Pompeo be brought back into that role, actually. I have no idea what Trump will do, but
And he's actually a bit of a hawk,
yeah.
I think, right?
No, but I think this is. I think I think he needs to build the cabinet can't be full of sycophants. Yeah, and I think what Pompeo has navigated and proven quite well is he's demonstrated. Trump loves loyalty. And people like Pompeo have been able to walk that tightrope of loyalty to the man at the top, while still staying true to some of his more traditional Republican principles. I'm a little bit more skeptical that Governor Haley, former Ambassador Haley, will be included, but we'll see. Maybe you could be pleasantly surprised. But let's see who he puts together as his foreign policy team. I think the Trump 1 administration proved that actually he operated a lot of foreign policy out of the White House and not out of the State Departments. So let's see, 1, who he puts into the State Department, and 2, who he puts in the National Security Council and who he surrounds himself with at the White House. And I think we'll start to learn that potentially even in the next few weeks.
Well, it definitely looks like a lot of people are warming up to Trump now. I saw that Michael Avenatti, I don't know if you remember him. He was the lawyer of Stormy Daniels.
Stormy Daniels.
He was not on very good terms with Trump, and he congratulated him now, glorifying him on Twitter. Yeah. So maybe he's hoping to be pardoned or something. I don't know.
Yeah, but interesting trivia side note. The British broadcaster Channel 4 chose to use Stormy Daniels as a political commentator for election night coverage, which is one of their more questionable journalistic decisions. But anyway.
Yes, I should like to add one short statement. I think from a European perspective that maybe Giorgia Meloni and Viktor Orban will gain more initiative in regards to the Ukrainian issue, and generally in the European Union, taking into account that the German-French alliance is weakened currently due to the governmental crisis in Germany and spiraling financial debt in France, plus the election gamble of Macron. So this could be now a window of opportunity for Giorgia Meloni and Viktor Orban to gain more profile in
excellent point.
The European Union and on Ukraine.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
All right, good. Any thoughts, remarks? Yes.
I mean, Trump during his campaign repeatedly used the term, the Green Deal scam, basically articulating the Green Deal and the concept of those kind of policies as one of the greatest scams of history, with a number of ideas about how to roll back those kind of things. Looking at how, in the Europe and currently in the Parliament with the hearings and everything, the clean industrial deal, the next step of the Green Deal in Europe is being articulated. I'm just very curious, how is it going to play out with a US president that just wants to roll everything back and take an entirely different route in terms of how to, not even deal with climate policy, but, use as much fossil fuels as possible, etc. Looking at what's happening in China, and, what do you think the impact will be for EU industrial policy with the direction of the new US administration?
Yeah, important point. Trump said he's going to do drill baby drill from day one.
Exactly.
And there's a great, I think that's an excellent point, and there's a slight irony in that one of his biggest supporters, Elon Musk, is pioneers for electric vehicles. And Trump did acknowledge the irony in that in some of his rallies. So I'll be curious to see how that, Trump has proven that he can be influenced by those closest to him. So I'll be curious as to his new relationship with Elon Musk and how that can impact his America First policy. And there is I think a more bizarre logic probably in Trump's mindset as it relates to EVs and green technology. If he thinks there's a roadmap to make America first on some of these new technologies and green initiatives, he could surprise some by actually having a slight green tint to his, but equally, as Peter correctly said, he has been very open about he is going to start drilling again in maybe up in Anwar in Alaska. He's even, one of the first tragic mistakes the Biden administration made was to cancel the Keystone XL pipeline. I don't know the specific, even if it's possible to resurrect it at this point, but Trump has always been very critical of that. So I think you'll probably see a balance on the US's energy policy, and certainly the stock market loves it. The Dow was up about 3% yesterday, and a lot of green and tech stocks were way up as well. So markets are always a pretty good indicator for some of these things. So I think it'll be a mixed bag. On from a competitiveness standpoint, though, AI I think will be a big one to watch. Europe has gone down this maybe misguided path where it's jumped to overregulate from the outset with the AI Act. Whereas the Trump administration, I don't think is going to touch this issue, and I think you'll see an incredibly light touch, if any, regulatory approach for tech companies.
So, a very good question. I think also it will be a mixed policy approach. The Trump administration most likely will try to lure more European corporations, green technology companies to the US, attracting them via favorable tax policies, and I think we mustn't forget that probably one of the strongest focuses in regards to international trade and security of the future Trump administration will be on China, and the US will have to compete heavily with the People's Republic on China, especially in regards to technology. And therefore, I think it will be a mixed policy approach, despite all these statements with drilling, etc. It will be something that Trump and his administration can't ignore to be competitive in the field of green technologies.
In that regard, I want to add that at the moment, after Putin cut the gas, I mean, in this, after the tit for tat on the sanctions, then we imported a lot of American LNG, which is shale gas. Shale is banned in Europe. We think that's bad for the environment, whereas the new technologies are not as bad anymore, is much better. But also, if you care about CO2 emission, which the Greens claim to do, in the States you see that when the fracking revolution erupted, the emissions went down in tandem, because a lot of the really dirty technologies or energy sources like coal could be phased out because there was cheap gas. So it's just so hypocritical. We're importing all this fracking gas, but we declared illegal, here at home. So going back, there's not necessarily a contrast between electric vehicles if it happens in a non-subsidized manner, and all these new technologies and basically old fossil fuel production. Right?
From a legislative standpoint, there'll be big pressure on, especially with their congressional majority, to repeal Biden's Inflation Reduction Act, which saw a lot, which ironically increased inflation, but there were huge amounts of green subsidies in that. So I think there's a good chance. I don't think Trump has said definitively whether he would look for a repeal, but maybe at least a partial repeal of some of the green subsidies in the Inflation Reduction Act. Which
would actually be very constructive to Europe, because one of the tension points is this massive subsidy law, IRA.
Yeah, I have a question directly related to that. So in the past, I guess 15, 20 years, the US has basically become more gained autarky in energy. Like I said, especially I think there were the imports in oil from Saudi Arabia were like 20-25%. Now they're down to 10%. The US is basically going back into nuclear again. I think it was one of the big techs, Microsoft, that even was buying or planning to build a nuclear power plant next to their artificial
and Amazon as well.
Yeah.
Maybe it was Amazon,
Both,
or Microsoft, both
yeah.
of them. So you have like a huge investment in nuclear. You have the shale gas revolution, making the US less dependent on the Gulf. So that's the question to Matt. How much is actually the interest of the US in the Gulf to maintain the position that they had for over the past years? I'm pretty sure it doesn't make a difference with regard to Israel and that basically preferred like friendship they have there. But how relevant is Saudi Arabia for them? And especially when you look at Saudi Arabia being interested into joining the BRICS Plus. So like, what will that position be the same? Like, because the geostrategical interest of basically preserving energy interest in the Gulf is, I think, very much limited at the moment.
Well, I think the first thing that should be said as it relates to the Gulf states is, if it wasn't for their intervention in light of the Ukraine conflict, from an energy standpoint, Europe would be in a far worse place. But I don't think it needs to be a zero-sum game in whether it's in Europe or in the US. More domestic energy reliance doesn't necessarily mean it doesn't necessarily translate as a bad thing for the Gulf states. For nuclear, private sector investment has to be welcome. You've seen it in the UK as well, with Rolls-Royce have funded some of these micro reactors. But this is where I think a Trump presidency, I think, will offer a better outcome for American-European relations with the Arab Gulf. He proved time and time again to be a good partner, especially for Saudi Arabia. And people know that region rightly have a long memory, and some of the things that then candidate Biden said in the 2020 election, just to score some cheap political points, he said some very disparaging and questionable things about leaders in the Gulf region, and whereas Trump, who's not always the diplomat, has always been very guarded and respectful as it relates to whether he was a candidate or president, his relationship and the language he uses for the region. So we'll have to see what his approach is going to be, but I don't think it's a zero-sum game. But I think it certainly would be, especially with BRICS as a growing force on the horizon. I think Europe and the United States would be wise to lean into their allies in the Arab Gulf.
Thank you. Yes?
Well,
And then Tim.
good morning, and thank you very much for the invitation. I have been in the Socialist Group, a member of the European Parliament Socialist Group for 10 years, but I'm here in the name of Social Justice, which is a small NGO. It is, I suppose, through Giulio Terzi, who is a senator from Fratelli d'Italia, is a good friend, and well, I've been in the Socialist Group, but I also have been in the inaugural ball of Mr. Trump in January 2017. So it's not from yesterday that I think Trump, of course, is something to celebrate. From my point of view of left, is something to celebrate, because he's obviously the freedom candidate, the one that is willing to confront totalitarian powers, and the one that I unreservedly prefer to see in the White House. But I would like to focus back on defense. I think that your argument on the pragmatism of Trump regarding technologies, I absolutely agree with it. But let's go back to defense. I remembered when this breakfast, NATO breakfast, I saw it, in live, when Mr. Trump was supposed to have been completely, disastrous, against NATO and so on and so on and so on. And that was not the case. I mean, he just said in his very typical language what has been in the documents for ages. I actually shared the delegation for relations with NATO when I was in the European Parliament, and that's obvious that the Americans were always pressing for Europe to stand up in terms of defense. He just said it in its very typical vocabulary. It's not very diplomatic, as we know. But I did not see it at all as anti-European, quite on the contrary. So my question is the following. Don't you think that, well, of course, he is a man that does not forget so easily. I think that Keir Starmer and the fact that he animated an NGO to make dirt on Mr. Trump, I mean, he's not going to easy relations with him, but don't you think that if there will be German elections, if there will be a prime minister that will say, well, we got your message. You are right. What you said in 2018, I think, NATO as European pillar has to stand up. We have to make up for defense. We heard it. We will comply. We will go with you. That will totally make a different scenario in Ukraine, because I do agree with, of course, not in 24 hours. I mean, it's the way he speaks. Not in 24 hours, but of course I think it's necessary to have a peace, even if it is East Ukraine, West Ukraine, like North Korea, South Korea, whatever. Even if it is like that, we must do some peace, because Ukrainians are asking for it as well. So don't you think this could be the way to change the situation? German leader that would assume this position.
In regards to Ukraine, or generally speaking?
Well, generally speaking, but of course with direct impact in Ukraine, because from my perspective, completely contrarily to Mr. Orban, of course that Russia will never stop in Ukraine. If they will win, they will continue. That's about it.
Well, NATO without the US is in shambles, and of course it is in the interests, I think, of the US administration, next US administration, to support the European allies and to help the Europeans to counter autocratic, I would say, regimes and governments. I think a new German government will invest and have to invest more financial funds or money into the field of security and defense. Why? Because Germany, as the largest economy still in the European Union, has a huge responsibility to go forward to be an example, to be more self-sustaining as Europeans, and not to be always coming back to the US to do the dirty job in regards on security and defense. The German army needs more financial funds in regards to material and personnel, and the obligations for Germany and for the Europeans are growing. From a geopolitical perspective, Germany and the European Union needs to be more present. This is my conviction. For example, in the Indo-Pacific, the European Union needs to be able, the member states, to safeguard, to protect international maritime routes, which they are currently not really able to do so without the US. So in regards to Ukraine, if governments, European governments, would go with Trump's, with his course to live up more to the obligations in security and defense, maybe this war, this terrible war, could come to an earlier end. I'm not really sure about it. It's a very difficult question, but the pressure is building up now already, although Trump isn't in office yet officially, that the Europeans have to wake up and really invest more money into the security and defense field, and be able to compensate for US support if the US shifts more towards even more to the Indo-Pacific and to
Lars,
East
sorry
Asia.
to interrupt, but you're German. Scholz gave this Zeitenwende speech, but then, as I understand, he has not actually delivered on his promises, right? There's not a big change in the German defense investment.
Well, it takes time.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but,
It is 100 billion euros, but it takes time, of course, to get to funnel the money into the army and to the relevant institutions. There's always, it has to go through Parliament. This is a very tedious process, but you are right. A lot of the part of the money still hasn't been called, and this is, of course, something that you can criticize the German government for not living up to their duties and their obligations.
Thank you. Tim, I thought you had a question, right?
Yeah, well, not a couple of observations and a question. I'm not so sure I fully agree with the idea that there's going to be I agree with you both in saying there's going to be a mixed economic approach in terms of green technologies and oil-driven technologies. I'm not so sure there'll be a complete repeal of the Inflation Reduction Act because there's quite a large chunk of subsidies going to congressional districts.
Partial repeal. Yeah, I completely agree with that.
You will not find
Yeah.
Republicans voting
Yeah.
so close to Christmas to be turkeys
Yeah.
on this. I mean, they will want to keep those subsidies, so let's get real on that. I'm also going to pick you up on your, I mean, there have been a number of interviews in the British media, everyone picking up on what Lammy said and Starmer said and what everyone else has said, and there was someone close to Trump this morning on the Today program pointed out that Musk has said similar things. The one advantage Britain's got is that we know we've got a government, whether I agree with it is a separate issue, but we've got a government in place for the next 4 years. Whether they will win a majority in 4 years' time, that's a separate issue. For the next 4 years, from a transactional planning point of view, you know what you're dealing with in London. Also, I would not underestimate Lammy's network in Washington, and I also wouldn't underestimate the fact that the Foreign Office has learned from Derek making some unfortunate remarks that got leaked to the press. So the Foreign Office is also aware that we need to build up relationships, and we've been doing it for quite a while. Labour and the Foreign Office have been building up links quietly behind the scenes. I mean, this morning we were interviewing Deborah Mattinson, who is a key advisor to Labour. She's been over in America advising the Democrats, and she said she wasn't surprised by the result. Neither was I. The fact she's been close to the Democrats advising them, they probably know better what's heading down the track than a lot of other commentators. And working from a position of number 10, plus the Foreign Office, plus a greater realisation that this was a likely result to be happening, I don't think Britain's unprepared. The question is, how many other EU countries are prepared? Another question, talking about personalities, I tend to support my old boss Charles Weller's comment that Maloney would be someone that could be dealt with. I know you mentioned Orban, but I'm sorry, Orban wouldn't have sufficient traction in this city, and it's going to be someone who's got traction in as many capitals as possible, plus this city, plus Washington. So I agree, Maloney is an interesting person to observe and how she plays it. But another name that's coming to mention was Rutte, because by all accounts, Rutte was quite close to Trump, and he's now in charge of NATO. So this goes back to first question, who else? Second question, how do you see this helping Britain? Because you've got the letter, you've got the Draghi reports, you've got the clear understanding that European defence is a basket case. From memory, 78% of the procurement comes from 4 countries: South Korea, Israel, America, and the UK. Now there's one country south of the border, south of here, that is clearly not happy with the idea that Britain gets brought back into a closer relationship with the EU in terms of defence and procurement. Well, I find that ironic given that Thales owns a chunk of British defence industry. But what do you see as the potential for the UK using this as part of their reset, and potentially, in a different way, from the outside, acting as a bridge and a partner? And then the final question is, what's the potential then for a partnership to develop between the UK and the US targeting China?
All right.
Excellent question. So, taking off my Tory hat for a second, I'd say credit to the Labour Party during the US presidential election campaign. It wasn't that publicised, but Keir Starmer And David Lammy did have a private meeting with then candidate Trump. I think it was in Mar-a-Lago at his compound there. And of course, aware that it was a positive engagement. I think, and correct me if I'm wrong because I haven't followed it recently, but one of the first things the Labour government did was it held off on making a decision as it relates to the British ambassador to the United States to wait and see what happens. Yeah.
Probably going to extend the current one.
Yeah. So I'd be curious to see just what type of personnel decision is made there. There have been some creative names floated, people like David Miliband, who I think would be a really interesting pick for that. No, I don't necessarily think, I agree with the premise of it. I don't necessarily think a Labour government would have any worse relations with a Trump administration than a Conservative or government. I think there are a couple things immediately the Labour Party perhaps need to mop up. One being the gaffe of some of their personnel as relates to sending campaign Labour Party officials to the US. There's an active lawsuit right now from the Trump campaign against the British Labour Party that's not insignificant. Was raised by Kemi Badenoch at Prime Minister's questions. But yeah, no, I think this is not a Corbyn government, in credit to Keir Starmer. I think if Labour are right about it, strategic about it, they will use the historic strength of the Anglo-American relationship and use that with leverage with the European Union. On a trade standpoint, I'm skeptical if you'll see a resurgence of the potential UK-US FTA negotiations. I don't think a Trump administration is going to be in a mood to deep dive into FTA negotiations, and certainly he's not a free trade Republican the way some in the rank and file of his party are. And on NATO, I think that Mark, your point as it relates to Rutte is an excellent point. And Trump is a relationship guy. Your point about Georgia, I do agree that Giorgia Meloni carries a lot more weight as a point person for negotiations than Orban. It puts her potentially into an incredibly powerful position. I think domestically in Italy, but on a European level, credit to the Italian Prime Minister, she's done an incredible job navigating some of the more populist right-wing elements of her government, but maintaining a healthy mainstream approach to European diplomacy. So maybe she'll continue to positively surprise those and extend that further afield as it relates to relations with President Trump. So yeah, I'm curious to see what the UK decision is on the next ambassador, and let's wait and see. But I think maybe there was a mea culpa in that private dinner in Florida as it relates to some of the more exotic comments of the foreign secretary. But in fairness, it's not just isolated issue to the Labour government. There's so many leaders across the European Union that have used unwise language, and there is an irony in this, in that so many that both domestically and internationally that demonize Trump, and Trump has said some awful and horrific things. We shouldn't. It's
called a locker room talk.
Yeah, locker room talk, and he said some pretty unsavory things. But so many who demonized him stress the importance of using responsible rhetoric and not to ramp up the temperature. Yet they have used, I think, comparing the guy to Adolf Hitler, it's probably as heated as you get, and that's been used by some in Europe. So I think they should take some of their own medicine and advice as it relates to responsible.
Hypocrisy is not unusual in politics, but you raised the UK-US free trade idea. That wasn't what I was driving at, but it's interesting, and I would agree with you on that. What I was driving at is that actually this whole situation, and what you've all said, the fact that Europe has to focus much more on the reality of defence, can it really do that? I mean, I was at a meeting in Ireland 2 weeks ago in Dublin, where they've got an election coming up, so let's see what he ends up being. But the current head of the lower house's European Affairs Committee and the former head of defence. And I asked the same questions, and I didn't really need to ask the questions because actually the chairman of the European Affairs Committee sort of led into it by saying it's ridiculous to keep Britain out. And that's what I was meaning is, how much could this whole strong emphasis on defence, combined with letter, combined with Draghi, combined with a close relationship and a better awareness of what's going on in Washington, be ironically leveraged to get Britain closer back into the EU in terms of the reset? I mean, there'll be some in Britain that will be arguing, oh great, perhaps we can now go off to the other side and sort of the part of the US and the United States on the other side of the Atlantic. But I'm more interested in the relationship within the EU.
So very briefly on that, credit to the Labour government. One of the only positive things I could say about their recent budget was the uptick commitment to getting to 2.9% as it relates to defence spending, and that should be welcome. The theory that I have as it relates to the new UK government's relationship as it relates to European defence and whether they lean on that, there was a lot of optimism from an economic standpoint in certain elements of the TCA, the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, that EU thought that Keir Starmer might unpick, even smaller things like Erasmus and youth mobility schemes that they have dismissed. I think there are some in Labour circles that might think, while they're pretty much, it's a continuation of Conservative government policy as it relates to the trade and cooperation side of things, the relations with the EU on a lot of things, that they might lean in to a slightly more closer relationship on defence to compensate for the fact that I think the reality is that there's very little difference economically from the previous Conservative government. That's just my...
Except one fundamental difference, Johnson ruled it out.
No, sure.
And there's no key communitarian.
And certainly this new government has not. Let's see what happens, but I wouldn't be surprised if you saw and certainly the part of the Labour, the reset, whether it's the John Healey, the defence, whether it's John Healey or David Lammy, they have been crisscrossing Europe and meeting with their counterparts there. So I think early indications are that they might, but that's an excellent question.
All right, good. And then maybe to sum up, Lars.
Well, maybe I can I ask? Please.
Yeah, sure, brief. And then because we have to move, but brief. Sure.
I would like to ask about Russia and whether EU and especially Germany should actually get into not good relations, because it's not about good relations, but basically doing some business with Russia. Because how do you think about it, and what do you think the new government will do? Because at the end of the day, like if we hear that Trump most likely will get better relations with Trump, of course. But what about us? Yeah, with Putin. Yes, what about us? What about Germany? Because as I see, the Germany is going down a little bit. Its economy is yes, but and that's what is missing. And so, what's your idea about this?
Maybe just one.
Sure. Yeah. Quick. Yeah.
We talked about defense a lot, and you said about efforts which Germany is making, but. In general discussion, I think there is a big clash, of course, between Eastern European countries and Germany when it comes to defense. Countries like Poland, they are claiming that, okay, we should also have funding from the EU, actually. So today it was discussing in the Parliament, the financial framework and what should be there. I heard about gender and equality, but when it came to defense, it was very tough conversation and very silent. So adding to this, that Germany has quite different approach. Sometimes it can seem for some countries in the EU a threat. So now, my question is, regarding the elections, do you think that the Trump is actually the president? It means that Poland now will continue, for example, countries like Poland, but generally speaking, countries closer to Russian border, they will more like now to talk to Trump and bilateral conversations with them than with Germans, or we'll have a scenario because of Trump, Germany will really start investing in defense, and then we can collaborate.
Well, thank you for these very good questions. Firstly, to your question, I think Germany is stuck. The economy is deteriorating. The German.
Why is it deteriorating?
But
What's the reason why the economy is deteriorating?
let me focus on it. Partly because for overregulation and other issues, but the German industry, the large corporations, and the backbone of German industry, small and medium-sized enterprises, they pay the heavy price for the sanctions. So the cheap energy, especially gas, coming from Russia, that has been capped. So because the German government supports the sanctions, it's stuck. And it is in the interest, of course, of the economy, of the corporations, and of, I think, the future German government to get access to, in the course of time, hopefully, again, to fossil fuels, to gas, to oil, especially coming from Russia. But how to do this is currently a very difficult issue. I think that the election of Trump, will not only be a wake-up call now to the mainstream European policymakers and to governments, but it will be like a boost to quickly, swiftly decide on how to ramp up joint measures to secure energy security and to even to funnel more funds into security and defense jointly, because the US or the Trump administration will put more pressure on the government, saying we are shifting our focus more towards the Indo-Pacific, more towards China, more towards East Asia, and it's you have to take care of yourselves now. You have to put more funds into your own security in order that you are able to avoid a second Yugoslavia or Kosovo, Serbia, etc. You have to solve these things. And I think this will probably unite partly the European stakeholders to take care of these issues themselves. In regards to Poland, I think not only the PiS government but the Tusk government now, they are convinced that the US, or without the US, national security will not be safeguarded. Therefore, they will still heavily develop their relationship with the US, will probably be more active in procuring military equipment from the US. And in regards to Germany, I think that the Polish government has a very pragmatic approach. Maybe the joint relationship will become better again with a new German government, maybe a Christian democratic liberal government. But generally speaking, I think the Polish government, the active government, main focus and interest is to rely on the US more than on Germany.
All right, well, I would like to hereby thank you, so maybe please join me in giving a round of applause before we go.